Thanks very much for inviting me here, David. And it's great to see a number of friends, and great to see former colleagues, and I'm anticipating a lot of action here later today. But I also feel a bit sad. Sad because this community has not been able to solve a problem which I thought I could leave safely 15 years ago, 13 years ago, and it hasn't been solved. Actually, it's getting worse as I look at it. What I want to do with you today is just give you a brief show where I am now, because that's also relevant to you guys. I'm now running a company in which I try to shift interventions in the cardiovascular suite from angiography, so exposure to radiation, to the MRI environment. So minimizing the radiation exposure while having a better anatomical vision in the MR. But everything in the MR needs to be reinvented. So that's why I'm doing this. And basically, I am making a class 3 medical device. So it's one of the worst medical device regulations you can run into. And the interesting thing is, we have a nanoparticle inside. So for regulatory purpose, this is what has been a very challenging issue. So I'll show you why we have the nanoparticle inside. Here you see an MR image of a heart, and basically the arrow is near the aortic arch. And you shift in the guide wire, and you can see the guide wire because it's not made of metal, so you can see it thanks to a marker that consists of iron oxide nanoparticles embedded in the wire. So the challenge you have for regulation is to show you have a potentially toxicological compound in it, because nanoparticles are considered worse in Europe than in the US, but it's in there, but the risk of getting out there is actually minimal. So they have a hazard, but for the medical device regulation, the intended use of the device and what's being done is actually dominating the total risk-benefit analysis. Not just risk, it's a risk-benefit. So that's probably something to keep in mind for the future, also for regulators here. Good. I told you, I was pretty surprised when the invitation came over, and because I thought we ended this with the famous editorial and the papers from Morfeld and Pauloon in particle fiber toxicology. I was invited to a Luxembourg meeting 3 years ago on the school, sitting on this topic, and I met Professor Graham again and said, hey, what are you doing? You still having these discussions on overload? You still don't talk to each other, guys? What's wrong here? So Gunther Fleming and I, we decided time for an editorial. We invited both people that were really not talking to each other, Peter Morfeld and Jürgen Pauloon, and we invited them to really give a position paper in particle fiber toxicology. Finally, the discussion in the forum where it needs to be, in the open literature. But then probably turned my back to business again and forgot all about it. Good. What I would like to show with you today, or share with you today, is that inflammation, at least in the rat, I'm only talking about rats today, and cells, rats and cells. Inflammation is the central response. Genotoxicity, at least in vivo, is the secondary effect of inflammation. In vitro, it's a different story. Inflammation, dose response, I will talk about. The interesting question is titanium dioxide really a special case? I think we had that already in the discussion up front, whether all GBPs should be classified as class 2 carcinogens. Simple idea. I don't see what the implication will mean. And I will put, I'm not fainting, but I will try to put the 19-dust study in some perspective, because I left the study, and I've seen the study as pretty much neglected, but I think there's some interesting lessons from that study. Okay, I can skip that one. So, particle toxicology and the D words, that was always how I teach my students this area. And I think we have had some teaching also this morning, because it's very important to teach the young people what we are dealing with and what the implications of our discussions are. And you also have to discriminate between the different levels of discussion. I hear Gunther say something, no, this is not a dose, this is a concentration. And this kind of remarks are extremely important, especially to people that are new to the field. So we are basically, if we talk about inflammation, we're talking about defense. And of course it's related to the other Ds, but it's a defense response. And that defense response in some species are different than in others. And it's apparently also related to a secondary outcome, or an outcome that is actually an adverse outcome. So inflammation, I would pose it's not an adverse event unless it's exceedingly and chronic, but it may lead to another outcome, cancer, which you certainly don't want to see. Good, toxicology, this is all nothing new to all of you. Particles are inhaled. We've seen some beautiful macroscopic and microscopic images from Dr. Schultz. This is just a cartoon showing you the same environment again. Particles go into the lung. They interact with macrophages. Those that escape phagocytosis, they can embedded by surfactant. Embedded by surfactant, they hit the epithelial cells. They can enter the epithelial cells. They can interact with mitochondria. They may or they may not enter nucleus. There's a lot of debate on that. We certainly don't have any evidence on that. And that whole interaction, both direct as well as secondary response, can cause an oxidative stress response. So the environment in the lung has a higher concentration of reactive oxygen species than can be taken away by our antioxidant system at some time after exposure. Good. I've seen, David, you've used the Equitalk scheme, but this is basically derived from pictures like this that we were using over already 15 years ago, teaching. So basically the only thing what's new is that sometimes you can call in a new mediator. And basically that's what toxicology does nowadays. You try to disentangle the processes you see here. The pointer? No, there's no. Who has the pointer right now? Sorry for that, you know. So what's important to realize is that the major outlay of the scheme has not really changed over the past 15 years. The only thing that changed is sometimes we have a new mediator. We have, instead of TNF, another cytokine coming in. And we have some different reclassifications or denominations of lesions that we describe. So what I would like to do with you is take you through the scheme and first start with some issues that the lab in Düsseldorf, or that we found during my time in Düsseldorf and also in the period after that. So this is some data from sorry, A549, so it's a tumor-derived cell line which has been exposed to titanium dioxide in vitro to low and high concentrations. And we have done extremely our best to see where these titanium particles are. And in this in vitro system, even up to very high dosing, we have never found any titanium, fine or ultrafine, in the nucleus. So that was one of the research goals we had. In contrast, we did find major interactions with titanium with the mitochondria. And one of these interactions that you have between ultrafine titanium dioxide and A549 cells is basically that you can see a generation in the cell of reactive oxygen species if you expose them to titanium dioxide. And you can measure the species by adding a spin trap, and the spin trap complexes with the reactive oxygen species, and you can measure that in the ESR. So in a cellular system, exposing that cell to titanium dioxide, of course this is in the presence of light, yeah? You can have this formation of reactive oxygen species. There's also, if you look at which cytokines are being expressed in that cell, it's a typical cytokine which responds to oxidative stresses, IL-8. And you can measure IL-8 both by mRNA expression as well as by protein levels. That is a typical response of a cell, and that's driven by the surface specific of titanium dioxide. And here you can see basically the effect being compared to silica, crystalline silica, which has a much higher oxidative stress and therefore a much higher IL-8 expression. So in vitro, in cell lines, you will see oxidative radical generation. You will see cytokine production as a result of that. I was wondering, where am I? Okay, good. I thought I had another slide in between. I'll come to that later. So the second pathway, or the second step in that process, is inflammation. It's a very important process, as we have heard this morning. The inflammation, which is driven by the mediators being released by either epithelial cells or macrophages themselves. You have a chemotactic peptide, you have peptides activating the cells, and they cause together, in an AUKUS, they cause inflammation. We have seen slides of that inflammation. This is a typical quartz-induced inflammation. And in that same slide, when you do a staining, as Professor Grimes said, this is in hydroxy-DG staining for the same tissue section that has been taken out of an animal treated with silica. You can see that in these areas where you see inflammation, you see hydroxy-DG. So it's an oxidative lesion to a specific part of the DNA, which is also being repaired pretty quickly. So if you look at the repair enzymes, you also see an induction of those. Now, upon an overload, as we see, the inflammation becomes very high. The inflammation becomes high, and due to that, you have a relatively decreased clearance, and that relative change in clearance can also cause a change in kinetics and distribution of your particle in the lung. So it's not just the particle itself, it's in the time process, things change. You have a redistribution of particles due to the higher dose. There was a very interesting, I think this is one of the most, there are a couple of key papers in this field, but this was published by the Edinburgh group by Lang Tran, and he was one of the first to show that if you instill or have rats inhaled with different GBPs or PSL, PSPs, however you call them, poorly soluble particles with low toxicity, you can see they cause an inflammation, and the inflammation is actually almost linear, log linear to the dose that you have instilled or the retained dose after an inhalation exposure. And that's different for titanium, barium sulfate. But then if you express them on a surface level, they are both fall on the same line, suggesting that the surface area is the part that really drives the absolute inflammation and maybe the metric needed for future legislation. So don't do the mass, but do the surface area. That was new at that time. It's really new. This is paper, I think it was 2002, could be wrong, yeah. But that's new. The concept of surface in that area was new. And of course, we know much more now than that not only surface is important, but also the properties of the surface. Now, here comes back to the defense. So when you inhale or instill a particle, the pulmonary system has basically two ways of getting rid of the invader. You have the upper respiratory tract that has the mucociliary escalator. So particles are embedded, catched into the, by the cilia and transported upwards. And then you have the lower respiratory gas exchange chart, which has only a clearance mechanism by using macrophages present or by cells that are attracted by inflammatory mediators. So it can be neutrophils, can be more macrophages coming in. So these together, they add up to total clearance. Now, from the study that I just showed by Tran, you can basically derive that this process of calling in new help for clearance has got inflammation. You could be considered, I say could be, as recruitment of cells that help to clear the invader. And what happens is you see that over this threshold, around 200 to 300 square centimeters, we're not talking about dose in milligrams, 200 square centimeters of particle surface, apparently is enough to trigger help. So you could also calculate that level back to a no adverse, no exposure, yeah, no effect level, you could say, if you accept this mechanism. Okay, now something interesting about the genotoxicity. I don't think, you may remember Kevin Driscoll's data. He has exposed animals to carbon black, quartz, different PSPs, and then he looked at HPRT mutations in the epithelial cells taken out from the same animals. And he found a relation between the inflammation in the animal and the HPRT mutation in the epithelial cell. Well, and the same he did by adding the cells ex vivo to a new cell line, which was human-derived, and also generated the same mutations. So it was the inflammatory cells able to causing the mutations ex vivo. We did a similar experiment, this time from rats treated, for this case, with different materials. It's all quartz, but quartz inactivated, quartz with coatings on it. We took out the lungs. The lungs, you do the lavage, and you measure the percentage of neutrophils. And then you digest out the epithelial cells, and in the epithelial cells, you let them grow, and you measure the micronuclei formation. That can only be done by growing the cells. And basically, what you see is the similar response. So you see the epithelial cells derived from a rat treated with an inflammatory particle has micronuclei in it, and that's almost linear, or you could say it's connected to the inflammation that was found in vivo. Good. Now we come to, I always love to use this slide because I know, and especially a number of years ago, some people refuse to understand the overload situation. But if you see slides like this, you know what we talk about. Well, this is a summary, tabular summary of the 19 dust study. And of course, it needs a bit of explanation and background. When I came to Düsseldorf, that was in 1998, I took over the department of late Professor Pott and all research investigations that were up and running there. This was a study I was confronted with because the study was done, animals were killed, and macroscopic investigations were done. Macroscopic. No microscopy, no histology, nothing has been done. And a lot of that data has been published as macroscopic observations. What I thought was my responsibility in the years on is to bring this study in pieces to the scientific community that we could understand, interpret, and have the right impact to risk assessment. Okay, this is a big table, so make it a bit smaller, but one of the materials being used was titanium dioxide. And then I also learned titanium dioxide is not titanium dioxide, but it was already used. So P25 is used as an ultrafine, and there was also a fine being used. We made pictures. I also learned that the ultrafine had a coating that was acidic by salinization, but the studies were done. You have to live with it. Now, this is interesting. If you simply look at these data taken out of the big table, I took fine and ultrafine titanium oxide. Here you have the doses, the number of animals, squamous tumors, bronchoalveolar tumors, and here I took out specifically the squamous keratinizing cysts. I took them out. So then you can see, first of all, the doses were huge. So from 30 to 120 milligrams intratracheally instilled, and this was done by a repetitive weekly instillation of up to 10 milligram per animal. So you can see here, by 120, you need to do a 12-week consecutive instillation. Now we know this is, of course, causing an overload, which you will see also by inflammatory data. For the ultrafine, this was the dose regime up to 60 and starting with 15. Well, the interesting thing is if you look at, we did a lot of work on genotox and looking at DNA damage in these animals, but the interesting thing is if you look at the dose response curve here on total tumors, starts with already 21 and goes up to 31, but the middle dose actually has a lower total amount of tumors, and the same here. So you can already suspect from this data that there was already a maximum effect at the lowest dose. But that was only by visual inspection of the data. The interesting thing about the cysts here is that seems to be an inverse dose relationship, whatever that would mean for titanium dioxide. Anyway, it shows that at these doses, the rat shows significant amount of tumors with this material, both ultrafine and fine. But the study was driven by another hypothesis. It was not driven by surface, but it was driven by volume. Now, first of all, let me show you that the data really fitted and really still fit into the commonly accepted risk assessment paradigms that surface is driving the amount of lung tumors, at least in the rat. And the study that you show here, these inhalation studies, are somewhat less sensitive, of course, than the IT studies. So this is the data of our study projected into that literature data. Now, I told you already, the study was designed by Pot as a volumetric study. So he basically wanted to see whether the volume of the particle instilled was a better metric than the surface. And this is what I'm trying to illustrate here. If you put the volumetric dose of what he used here and expose that to the tumor, then you have fine and ultrafine scattered all over the place. There seems to be some kind of relation here, but it's certainly not better than the graph I just showed you where the surface was related. And here you can see the volumetric dose when you do this for different particles. If you do that, you see some kind of, you have particles that fit on this list, which happen to be titanium dioxide, and some particles that are carbon black fit here, as well as the titanium ultrafine. Just to show you what the original study hypothesis was and why these high dose regimens were chosen to test the volumetric hypothesis. I would say it's not a better descriptor than surface. Good, this brings us to the cancer and fibrosis issue. So what I tried to do is, I already left Düsseldorf, but I still had a lot of contact there. And with Peter Morfeld, you well known, Peter is an epidemiologist, and what we tried to consider is look at this animal cohort, this animal study as an epidemiological cohort. I know it's dangerous, some people will probably look at me, what's he doing now? About 2,000 rats were instilled with different doses of particles. These 2,000 rats survived for a number of time. So you can consider them as a cohort being exposed to a certain dose and study them by a regression model and simply look at which factors at the end of their life determined their lifespan, whether that was the dose, the height of the dose, or other factors that you include in the study. The other way around, you can also calculate how much information on mortality you could have predicted from less part of the cohort up to the total cohort. So it's basically an animal epidemiological study we did. And one of the questions we wanted to answer is, in risk assessment committees we always have that discussion, is fibrosis a necessary step to the cancer? That may be easy because then we have a mechanism and we can say if we don't see fibrosis we can, at least that's a way to deal in regulatory committees. So I don't need to show this, but this is the typical rat fibrosis after 2 years after exposure, subepithelial fibrosis in the bronchus, and interstitial fibrosis. Typically, and this is in the presence of, let's say, after diesel exposure. Fibrosis was scored by pathology. It was serious chrome staining, and you can use the specific scoring for fibrosis you can use. And basically, you can see here that there is fibrosis, that the fibrosis is also different between different materials installed, but also based, of course, on the doses. And there we started to calculate what we call an odds ratio. It's a connection between if an animal has a fibrosis, has fibrotic tissue in it, in the same section of that animal can you also find a tumor. That's basically expressed by this odds ratio. And you see, in most animals, there is an increased odds ratio, but it's not significant. So basically, there is no statistically elevated level for the relation between fibrosis and a tumor presence. Not in this cohort of animals with all different exposures. And so despite the fact that particle mass induced fibrosis, there's no consistent relation between the fibrosis and tumor presence. So you see, the more mass you instill, the more fibrosis, but apparently fibrosis has not a one-to-one relationship with cancers. That's something you can do with your cohort of animals in addition to whatever question you wanted to be answered. I thought this is an interesting exercise I wanted to share with you. Well, you can do the same thing here. As I told you, you can use a Cox regression model and express the survival of the animal and the death by the tumor, because by tumor the animals were usually killed. You see survival, proportional dose versus and a number of interaction terms. And the interesting thing, this was published by Peter and me, I think 2006 or 7 in Elation Toxicology. There you can see you have a prevalence rate of the tumors in time, so you can see the first tumors are already being induced within am I doing in time right? Yeah, okay, fine. You can see first tumors are actually being increasing after this time, so after 1 year already. And then, of course, the major impact of tumor formation hits in after 1.5 years up to 2 years. Then you have different models in how you can explain for the evidence. And that's really interesting, because that's when you come in with coefficients, and you can test the coefficients with a level of significance. Now, of course, here you have mass dose is a significant descriptor of the lifetime of an animal being dosed with a PSP. And the same calendar time is not a descriptive. High surface is a descriptor, but lower than mother. So you can use different models to explore your data set beyond the fact than just making linear dose response curve, knowing that you're already overdosing. But this is a very interesting exercise, because this shows you, and this, I think it's the statistical evidence to show that beyond a 40-man, you can look at this cohort and see where do things happen? When do I see changes in the model? So you can vary with the dose as a descriptor in the model, and then you can see that beyond 40 milligram dose, that is basically the cutoff for cancer being caused in this study. So basically 40 milligram is the threshold being derived by a Cox model for this study causing cancer in this animal over a lifetime. The other interesting finding, this is another statistical analysis you can do, is that basically rats treated with doses over 80 milligrams, see how close it is, do not really contribute to diminish the statistical variation in the data set. So you could also say the rats dosed over 80 milligrams were actually done for nothing. Statistically, they did not contribute to a better description of the model. That is, I would say, a bad design. At least it's the outcome that they were clearly overdosed by a statistical evaluation, not by an emotional one, but by a statistical one, and without even looking at inflammatory outcome. Okay, so to wrap up, I think I will keep it like that. Inflammation I still consider, and I showed that with several pieces of evidence. There is much more that we showed, that inflammation is a central response to particle inhalation. The secondary effects of inflammation in rats include genotox, but there is also genotox caused directly. I don't think we can discuss that away, but it's a balance between what is more present than other. The inflammation is also driving the fibrosis. And I also showed that fibrosis and lung cancer, they are there, but it's not a statistical significant relation, at least not in the rat. And therefore, I would say the 19 dust study, I think we can get away with it now, but it fits into the current perspective, although the dose rate was high, and about 80% of the animals was actually overdosed and do not contribute to our further understanding. And I would also like to say that titanium dioxide, for me, is not a special case as compared to all the other PSP. And that brings me back to your question. Maybe the approach for this community would be to maybe step out of your own titanium box and consider how this field is being operated, driven by other discussions, and see whether the other particles could actually help you to find an alternative approach. With that, I conclude my plea and give the word back to the chair. Thanks.
Your opportunity to come up with questions, comments to Dr. Borm. Mei Yong, we're going to hear from you later at the conference.
Yes, thank you. I'm Mei Yong from Evonica Essen. One comment, and I'm very fond of your idea to look at the different stages in your animal epidemiology studies. I find it very interesting because you can use the multi-state models usually we use in the human epidemiology studies.
Yeah.
And one question is, you have found a threshold of dose 14 milligram in the rats. And are you able to re-evaluate your data to find a surface area to the cancer and tumor?
Yes, we can. I don't have it by heart, but that data is available, and it was also in the model. It was in the model. I just have to find it for you. I think there is a surface area as well.
You can use the same Cox model to find the color.
Yeah.
And
It was actually in the model, so it should be there.
yes, I know. Okay, thank you.
Sounds like you're going to stay in touch for more of that information. You've got any more interventions, questions? Also going to move to the tables somewhat more in the back, but we're never going to force anybody to intervene. Voluntary interventions only. Yes?
It's lunchtime, I think, you know.
I'm sorry, not the typical question. So you are saying you use that Evonik P25, which is an acidic compound, and you actually exposed those rats for 2 years with this compound. So not just your natural feeling. Are you feeling good about the, say, toxicity, or do you think it was a bad result? So do you think it was more on the harmless side or more on the bad side?
It's funny that you asked that question. You know, I was confronted with the study. I would never have dosed such high doses in the animal. But you have to agree that if you look, we did a lot of subsequent work with titanium dioxide. Also with changing the surface by methylation in collaboration with the Fubini group in Italy. So you can modify the surface of titanium and you see a lot of changes in that material. So the hydrophobicity of the surface, once suggested as being more inflammatory, was actually found by us to be less inflammatory. And I think I agree with you on your very initial remark that the surface of titanium is much more active than we think. Having it siliconized for product quality is something else than having it modified for technological applications. And I mean, titanium, I don't have to tell you, it's everywhere. So it's being applied in every kind of, and it's a very versatile material which you can modify, but then you also have to accept that that modification has of course also a chemical effect that can occur in the body or in tests that are being used for hazard assessment. So Günther was saying it's dark in the body. Yeah, it's dark in the body, but before it's dark in the body, the titanium is tested in 10 tests where it's already found genotoxic in this, that, and that. And these are things that material science has to meet the toxicology in an honest way to communicate what did I do to that particle. And we learned that, you can ask that Professor Krug, we learned that lesson in nanotechnology also. Because there the devil is in the detail. If you have a small gap in electron transfer in the surface, you may end up with completely different properties. And that's the only thing that you guys know in industry.
Okay, more questions, interventions from you? Yes.
Paul, a couple of questions. First of all, the 40 milligrams that you identified as the threshold dose, and that is due to installation study, right?
Yeah.
And did you actually, or did anybody actually measure what was retained there? Because people easily assume what you instill is there, but that's not true, yeah? Because you get not everything down into the lung.
True.
Yeah.
Good question. I have to trace that out. I think we did that in part of the animals by ashing the lungs and looking at how much was what was the retention of, but not for all rats. So it was done.
Professor Albert Doster.
Then the other question is, I'm also a proponent of the surface area concept, yeah, as you may know. And but rather than just surface area per se, I'm trying, and I post that as a last question at the end of my talk, is trying to maybe express that as specific surface area reactivity.
Yeah.
And there are nice data out there to do that, and compared also to the in vitro and vivo correlations, which we and others have done, and that looks pretty good. So that would tell you that not all GBS particles, whatever you call them, have the same specific surface area reactivity. So it may be one way to categorize different materials with this method.
Would you agree?
I fully agree. You need to add to surface area in a product something that corrects for, I would say, intrinsic surface reactivity. It's a multiplication of the surface in case it's very reactive in case of quartz. That could be an approach. And from pharmacology, you use it intrinsic activity, but could be something else.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more interventions? Yes.
Thank you. Michel Houillard, former Secretary General of the Industrial Minerals Association, now independent consultant. I fully share your comment. It's very strange that we are still here discussing the same things after 25 years. We acknowledge that the rat is not the model we may really rely upon for human, and that the hazard-based legislation we have in Europe is not manageable. Okay. Having said that, I'm coming to your conclusion that titanium dioxide is just another example of PSP. That's nothing very special. And I would like to hear you about silica in your plausible mechanism graph, because you really have the same mechanism. And we have heard Günther Oberdersch saying, well, it's a highly toxic substance which deserves the category 1 classification. Is it a question of classification, or is it a question of the potency and the threshold for inflammation? What is your point of view?
This is, I would say this is a tricky question, isn't it? Yeah, the discussion Günther and I just had is that if you consider quartz as having just a multiplication factor to correct for its surface, which is low, but it has a tremendously active surface, and by that you have some kind of a penalty for the surface. I think that more or less underestimates the danger of quartz, because quartz also works on the other side, not only defense, but it's also a very durable particle. It's not being cleared at all. And the surface is known to be very active. So I'm inclined to say keep quartz out of the discussion. We use it and we learn a lot from quartz in these models. But to keep the discussion clear on this issue, I would stay away from this, because you would immediately mix in with discussions like coal dust. Why is quartz in coal dust not causing lung cancer? A very rightful question. No, I would say keep it out of this discussion, because it doesn't fit entirely the model and would bias the discussion.
Okay. Any more interventions, questions at this stage? There will be plenty more after lunch, of course. What are we taking to lunch from this morning?
Looks like it.
I remember we're in the business of protecting humans, and we are not rats. What would be your final thought, also after everything you've heard this morning and before we go into lunchtime, Dr. Borm?
Yeah, I heard several times we're not protecting rats, we're protecting humans. I still remember sitting in the one of my last meetings in the IARC when we classified coal mine dust, or silica basically, and we came up with the evidence, hey, come on guys, we have a real-life exposure where there is a tremendous amount of quartz, silicas in coal mine dust, and we know in that situation, coal mine dust, we know there is no lung cancer in coal mines except for the smoking ones. So there's pretty good negative evidence that a particle containing that carcinogen is not causing lung cancer. And that was at the very last day of that IARC meeting. And I still remember there was some kind of hesitating and doubt whether we should dive into this issue, because in a panel, you have a 2-day workshop. In a panel, you want to come to an end. There needs to be an end, and the pressure was high. But I think that was historically for this group a very important moment that we missed, because we could have said, okay, there is a exposure entity which contains a carcinogen, but for some reason, in real life conditions, up to whatever you have for pathological conditions, there's no evidence for cancer. So that's a missed opportunity. We cannot take that back, but I would say that is something you need. Cases like that, don't let that go in the future. I have a clear feeling that for titanium dioxide, but also for other particles, we are beyond the level where we want to be in risk assessment. But our regulatory pathways force us into the way we can run. We have to take the metro line, there's nothing in between. And that is the only thing which we discussed. We can either change the regulation or we can change the data. But the data has already formed our paradigm, how we discuss this. We all have the same paradigm. And I think one of the things would be, if you cannot change the regulation, try and get away from the paradigm. But that is something you have to step out of the box and see whether you can discuss in a new way with regulators the amount of data which is there. But that's not an easy, then you have to really rethink everything you have done in the past 20 years.
And maybe a few minutes before lunch is the right time to submit that question about changing the paradigm to Professor Grime before we go to lunch, with a final thought on this. And of course, we will continue the conversation this afternoon and tomorrow, but just before lunch to make sure we enjoy it even more.
Well, I think we enjoy lunch anyway, but without or not. Now, I don't think that we should change the paradigm. We have the data, and I think we can more or less are able to interpret the data in a proper way. And sure, there is additional information. What we have to address in addition is the counterbalancing mechanisms in the lung during exposure. It is the reactive oxygens are produced. There is a lot of spontaneous reactive oxygen produced in the lung. But this is scavenged by GSH, and then there are consequences on DNA adducts and oxidative DNA adducts are extremely large amounts per cell per day. All these are repaired. And then we have, what we need to understand is under what conditions are the scavenging reactions overwhelmed. And all that is known, or the parts of this is known. What we should change is the regulation.
Okay, and you will have the final word on this before we go to lunch. It was your session, your presentation.
Very brief, because I don't want to keep us away from lunch. I think we here as this group are way beyond the know-how of our current legislators. Our legislators sitting at crucial positions do not have the know-how and that we have built over the past 20 years on this case. So you need to step down at some time and realize that the tests, the protocols, the people sitting there are simply not able to work with the flexibility we would like to hand them. We'd like to give them, if you do this, you can do that. They have not the ability to do so. And with that, sorry.
Thank you so much.